In the early hours of January 3, 2020, the silence above Baghdad's airport was shattered by a sudden flash of fire. Within seconds, a convoy moving through the dark highway was gone. Inside one of those vehicles was one of the most powerful military figures in the Middle East, Iranian General Qasem Soleimani. The strike had been ordered by the United States. But what happened in those next few hours, inside the Pentagon, behind closed doors, would determine whether the world was about to witness another devastating war. Because no one knew how Iran would respond. And intelligence reports were already warning, retaliation was coming dangerously fast. Inside the US Department of Defense, the atmosphere turned tense almost immediately. Phones rang non-stop, screens filled with satellite images, intercepted communications, and classified intelligence briefings. Military commanders, analysts, and advisors rushed into secure rooms. They all understood one thing. Killing Qasem Soleimani was not a small operation. He wasn't just a general. He was the commander of Iran's elite Quds force, the architect behind Iran's military strategy across the Middle East, and a man many in Iran considered a national hero. For years, American intelligence agencies had tracked his movements carefully, but eliminating him carried enormous risk. Now that risk was becoming real. Within hours of the strike, US intelligence agencies began intercepting unusual communications across Iran and among Iranian-backed militias. Something was happening. But what exactly Iran was planning remained unclear. That uncertainty created the most dangerous situation possible. Because when two powerful nations prepare for conflict without fully understanding the other's intentions, a single mistake can ignite a war. Inside the Pentagon, advisors gathered around large digital maps of the Middle East. Red markers highlighted US military bases across Iraq, Kuwait, Qatar, and Bahrain. Thousands of American troops were stationed there, and many of those bases were within range of Iranian missiles. Defense officials faced a terrifying question. If Iran launched a large-scale retaliation, how quickly could the United States respond? More importantly, could they stop a war before it began? Meanwhile, across Iran, the mood was explosive. Millions of people poured into the streets. Funeral processions stretched for miles. Crowds chanted for revenge. Iranian leaders publicly vowed that the United States would pay a heavy price. And those statements were not just political theater. Iran possessed hundreds of ballistic missiles capable of striking US bases across the region. Intelligence analysts knew that if Iran launched a coordinated attack, American soldiers could be killed within minutes. And if American forces responded with full military power, the conflict could spiral far beyond Iraq. Suddenly, the entire Middle East was on the edge of a wider war. Inside the Pentagon's secure briefing rooms, tension grew hour by hour. New intelligence reports kept arriving. Some suggested Iranian-backed militias might attack US embassies. Others warned of rocket strikes on American bases. But the most alarming reports involved Iran's missile forces. Satellite surveillance showed unusual activity at Iranian missile sites. Vehicles were moving. Missiles appeared to be preparing for launch. Still, no one could confirm exactly when or where Iran might strike. This created a dangerous dilemma. If the United States responded too aggressively, it could provoke Iran into a larger war. But if the US waited too long, thousands of troops could be exposed to a deadly attack. The decision required perfect timing and perfect information. But in the world of intelligence, perfect information rarely exists. Days passed under extreme tension. American forces across the Middle East were placed on high alert. Troops slept in protective gear. Air defense systems were activated. Fighter jets were placed on standby. At every base, commanders prepared for the worst. Then, the intelligence warnings became more specific. Iran was likely preparing a missile strike, and the target would almost certainly be inside Iraq. The Pentagon faced a terrifying countdown. If missiles were launched, they would reach their targets in minutes. There would be almost no time to react. Behind closed doors, advisors debated the options. Should the United States strike Iranian missile sites first? Should they evacuate troops? Or should they wait and hope Iran's response remained limited? The wrong decision could trigger a massive regional conflict. Finally, on January 8, 2020, the moment arrived. In the darkness before dawn, Iranian missile forces launched more than a dozen ballistic missiles. Their targets were two Iraqi bases housing American troops. One of them was the Al-Assad Air Base. Inside the base, soldiers had only minutes of warning. Sirens screamed across the compound. Troops rushed into bunkers. Some barely made it inside before the first missile struck. The explosions shook the ground. Massive fireballs lit up the night sky. Concrete buildings collapsed. Debris flew across the base. Wave after wave of missiles crashed down. Inside the Pentagon, officials watched the attack unfold in real time. Satellite feeds and radar data showed the missiles hitting their targets. For several terrifying minutes, no one knew how many soldiers had been killed. A full American military response was already being prepared. Bombers could be launched. Missile strikes could begin. But one crucial piece of information was still missing: casualties. If large numbers of American troops had died, the pressure for retaliation would be enormous, and that retaliation could quickly escalate into full war. Minutes felt like hours. Finally, reports began arriving from the bases. Buildings were destroyed. Equipment was damaged. But something unexpected had happened. Most American troops had survived. Early warning intelligence had allowed them to take shelter before the missiles arrived. Although many soldiers later suffered traumatic brain injuries from the blasts, there were no immediate combat deaths. Inside Washington, the atmosphere shifted. Iran had retaliated, but the scale of the attack appeared carefully limited. Some analysts believed Iran may have intentionally avoided killing large numbers of Americans to prevent further escalation. It was a dangerous signal, but also an opportunity. Now the United States faced another critical decision: respond militarily or step back. Behind the scenes, diplomatic messages quietly moved through international channels. Both sides appeared to recognize the same terrifying truth: if either nation pushed further, the Middle East could explode into war. Thousands of civilians could die. Oil routes could be disrupted. Global markets could collapse. And millions of lives could be changed forever. In the end, the United States chose not to launch immediate retaliatory strikes. Iran also signaled that its response was complete. The world stepped back from the edge. But the events of those tense days revealed something deeply unsettling: how close the world had come to a much larger conflict. A single drone strike, a few missiles in the night, and a handful of decisions made inside quiet rooms filled with maps and glowing screens. Moments where hesitation or miscalculation could have changed history. For thousands of soldiers stationed across the Middle East, the danger had been very real. For millions of civilians living in the region, the possibility of war had hung in the air. And for the leaders making those decisions, every minute carried unimaginable pressure. Because sometimes, the difference between war and peace is not a battle, not a treaty, but a decision made in the final seconds before the missiles fly.